Before there was light, there was counsel. The gods gathered in darkness in the time before time at a place called Teotihuacan, the place where men become gods. 4 suns had already lived and died. 4 worlds had already been swallowed, one by jaguars, one by hurricanes, one by fire raining from the sky, one by a flood that drowned every living thing but the fish. 4 times creation had failed. The gods stood now in the ruins of their own ambition and asked a single question. Who will burn so the 5th world may see? 2 came forward. Tecuchistecatl, proud and rich, dressed in quetzal feathers and gold, certain the honor belonged to him. And Nanahuatzin, a small and diseased god, his body covered in sores, who offered himself not because he was worthy, but because someone had to. A great fire was built. Tecuchistecatl approached it 4 times, and 4 times his courage failed him. The heat turned him back at the very edge, his fine feathers scorched, his golden pride useless against the flame. Then Nanahuatzin walked forward without hesitation and threw himself in. He did not flinch. He did not return. Shamed, Tecuchistecatl followed. The gods waited in the dark, uncertain which direction the new sun would rise. When it finally broke the horizon, it was Nanahuatzin, transfigured, blinding, the sores of his mortal body burned away into pure and merciless light. Tecuchistecatl rose beside him as the moon, and out of jealousy, the gods threw a rabbit into his face to dim his brightness, so that the sun would never have to share its glory. But the sun did not move. It hung there, motionless, staring down at its makers with an unbearable, unblinking heat, and it said nothing. It simply waited. The gods understood then what they had done. Light was not free. A sun does not walk across the sky out of habit. It must be paid. And so the gods did what the sun itself had done. They gave their own hearts, their own blood, spilling themselves into the dust of Teotihuacan, so that Nanahuatzin, now called Tonatiuh, would finally, mercifully, begin to move. One god alone refused. Xolotl, twin of the feathered serpent Quetzalcoatl, patron of misfortune and of the strange and the deformed, looked at what was being asked of his fellow gods and ran. He transformed himself first into a stalk of maguey to hide among the fields, then into a salamander burrowing into the mud of a furrow, then finally into an axolotl, slipping beneath the water of a canal in the desperate hope that the sacrifice gatherers would simply pass him by. They did not. He was found in each disguise in turn, and in the end, he too was given to the debt he had spent the whole of that terrible night trying to escape. Even the myth of the sacrifice's origin, in other words, already contained the story's whole emotional architecture in miniature, a debt owed, a desperate wish to be excused from paying it, and the calm, unmoved certainty of those administering the payment that excusal was never, under any circumstance, going to be granted. Every captive who would ever climb the stairs of the Templo Mayor in the centuries that followed was, whether he knew the old story or not, walking a path a god had already tried and failed. To walk around, this is the detail that separates the Mexica account of their own religion from the flattened caricature later centuries would settle for. The gods who received blood at Teotihuacan were not distant, untroubled powers extracting a tax from creatures beneath their notice. They were, in the Mexica's own telling, gods who had first paid the debt themselves, who understood exactly what it cost because they had felt the fire close over their own bodies, and who had watched one of their own kind try, in very human panic, to avoid the very payment the whole of creation now depended upon. When a Mexica priest asked a captive to give what the gods themselves had once been forced to give, he was not, in his own understanding, asking for something he and his gods had exempted themselves from. He was asking humanity to keep faith with an arrangement its own creators had entered into first, at a cost no one, not even a god, had found easy to pay. This is how the Mexica, the people history would later call the Aztec, understood the sky above them. Not as a gift, as a debt. Every dawn was proof that someone, somewhere, had paid for it, and every generation inherited the bill. They called this age the 5th sun, Nahui Olin, the sun of movement, and they knew, with the calm, absolute certainty of a people who had built their entire civilization on the fact that it too would end. The first 4 suns had died from the gods' failures. The 5th would die from man's. It was written into the calendar itself, spinning forward toward a day no one could name when the earth would shake, when the Tsitsimime, the star demons crouched in the darkness beyond the sky, would descend and devour what remained of humanity. Between the birth of the fifth sun and its promised death lay only one instrument capable of holding back the end: blood, human hearts, offered back to the sky in the same gesture the gods had made at Teotihuacan. Not out of cruelty, out of arithmetic. The universe had a cost, and the Mexica had appointed themselves its creditors. This is a story of a single day inside that arrangement. A day like 10,000 others in the Valley of Mexico, in the last great flowering of an empire that would not survive to see its own 100th summer under Spanish eyes. A day when the sun rose, as it always did, because someone had agreed to pay for it. Dawn breaks now over the lake. Mist lifts from the water in slow curling ribbons, gray turning to gold as the light climbs the eastern mountains. Somewhere below, a conch shell sounds, low and mournful, rolling out across the water toward a city built where no city should exist. An island of stone rising from a lake, humming already in these first gray minutes, with the machinery of an empire that fed its god with its own children. The debt has come due again. It always does. To stand at the edge of the water at first light and see Tenochtitlan rise from the mist was to understand, instantly, physically, in the chest before the mind could catch up, that this was not a village pretending at grandeur. This was one of the great cities of the earth. It should not have existed at all. 2 centuries earlier, the Mexica had arrived at the shores of Lake Texcoco as refugees, driven from place to place, unwanted by every city that already held the good land. Legend said their priests saw an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a serpent on a small marshy island no one else had wanted, and took it as a sign from Huitzilopochtli, their patron god of sun and war, that here, nowhere else, they would build. They built on mud. They drove wooden piles into the lake bed, wove reed mats, piled soil upon the mats until the soil held, and called this new land into being one basket of earth at a time. What rose from that impossible beginning, by the time the sun climbs fully over the mountains on this particular morning, is a city of perhaps 200,000 souls, larger than Paris, larger than any city in Spain, laced together by canals instead of streets, its temples whitewashed and painted in red and blue and gleaming under a coat of morning dew. 3 great causeways stretch from the island to the mainland, wide enough for 10 men to walk abreast, built with removable wooden bridges so that in war they could be pulled away, turning the city itself into a fortress surrounded by water. Along the shallow edges of the lake float the chinampas, floating gardens, rectangles of woven reed anchored to the lake bed, piled high with rich black mud and planted with maize, beans, squash, chili, and flowers, so many flowers, entire fields of them blooming on the water itself. A Mexica farmer pulls his narrow canoe between the garden plots this morning, harvesting marigolds for the temple, and the whole lake, for a moment, smells sweeter than it should for a city that will, before the sun sets, run red at its center. At the heart of the island, behind a wall carved with writhing stone serpents, rises the Templo Mayor, the great temple, twin pyramids joined at a single towering base. Over 40 meters high, painted blood red on one side for Huitzilopochtli, the god of the sun and war, and blue on the other for Tlaloc, the god of rain and the fertile earth. Steep stairways climb each face of the pyramid, and even from here, from the canoe gliding between the flower gardens, a keen eye can make out the dark, permanent stains that no rain has ever fully washed from the stone. Beneath the temple's shadow spreads the great market of Tlatelolco, which will, within the hour, hold as many as 60,000 people buying and selling gold and turquoise, cacao beans used as currency, jaguar pelts, feathers of the quetzal bird traded up from the southern jungles, obsidian blades sharper than the finest steel Europe has yet forged, slaves, dogs bred for eating, human hair, medicine, poetry recited for a coin, Spanish soldiers who will see this market only decades from now. Men who have walked through Rome and Constantinople will write home that they have never in their lives seen anything to equal. Government here operates through a formal hierarchy that would not have looked entirely foreign to a Roman senator or a Chinese magistrate, judges hearing cases in dedicated courts, tax assessors touring the provinces with painted tribute registers, a network of runners capable of relaying a message from the Gulf Coast to the capital in a single day, trading it hand to hand along maintained roads at a pace European messengers would not match for centuries. This is not a society organized around chaos and blood alone, whatever the chroniclers who came after its fall preferred to claim. It is one of the most rigorously ordered civilizations the world has produced, a lattice of schools, courts, tax registries, poetry competitions, astronomers who tracked the movement of Venus with an accuracy that would not be matched in Europe for another century. Children of commoners attend the Telpochkali, the House of Youth, to learn discipline, war, and craft. Children of the nobility attend the Kalmakak, where priests teach them the sacred calendar, the songs of creation, the art of rhetoric, and the terrible weight of what it means to rule a people who believe the sun itself depends on them, and over all of it, humming beneath the market noise and the canal traffic and the smell of copal incense drifting from 100 small shrines, runs the current that gives this whole civilization its shape and its horror in equal measure, the conviction, absolute and unshaken, that none of this, the temple, the market, the floating gardens, the eagle on the cactus, the sun itself crossing the sky above it all, survives without blood. Today, as every day, someone will pay that price. The city does not pause to consider whether it should. It has never occurred to the city to ask. Before any of it reaches the temple stairs, the empire has to be fed, and long before the drums begin at the Templo Mayor, the city is already awake and working. In a modest reed and adobe house near the southern edge of the island, a woman named Sitlalmina rises before the light does. She kneels at the metate, the stone grinding slab worn smooth by her mother's hands before hers, and begins the labor that will consume most of her morning, grinding soaked maize kernels into the wet dough that will become the day's tortillas, a task so central to Mexico womanhood that girls begin practicing it on small toy-sized metates as soon as they can hold a grinding stone at all. It will take her hours. It takes every woman in this city hours every single day, and the sound of stone against stone, a low, steady, grating rhythm, is more than the drums or the conch shells, the true and constant heartbeat of Tenochtitlan. Her husband, Ocelotl, is already gone, poling their canoe out to the family's chinampa plot before dawn, where he will spend the day weeding, watering by hand from the canal, and checking the maize stalks now standing chest high, interplanted with beans that climb the maize like a second crop sharing the same small patch of reclaimed lake mud. The chinampa system he works is, by any honest measure, one of the most productive agricultural technologies developed anywhere in the pre-industrial world, capable, acre for acre, of yields that would not be matched in Europe for centuries. The constant nutrient-rich lake water doing the work that fallow fields and manured soil did more slowly elsewhere. It is this system, more than any other single fact, that explains how an island city with no surrounding farmland managed to feed 200,000 mouths and still produce a surplus large enough to be hauled. In tribute to every corner of the empire, Ocelotl is not a soldier by trade, though like every commoner male, he trained in his youth at the Telpochkali and could be called to war within days if the city required it. Most of his life is agricultural, and most of the empire's life is agricultural, whatever the temples and the Tzompantli suggest to a visitor's eye. The vast bureaucratic machine that keeps Tenochtitlan alive runs on tribute rolls kept by trained scribes, painted in vivid pictographic script onto long folded sheets of bark paper, recording precisely what each conquered province owes and when, so many loads of cotton cloth from this town, so many baskets of cacao from that one, so many feather-worked cloaks, so much maize, so much firewood, so many captive slaves for labor or for the altar, itemized with the same bureaucratic precision a modern tax office would recognize. By mid-morning, Sitlalmina's eldest daughter, a girl of 9 named Xilonen, is sent to the market at Tlatelolco with a small basket of woven mats her mother made in the evenings to trade for salt and chili peppers. The market she enters is already a roar of noise and color. A designated official, the Tianquistli judge, moves between the stalls, resolving disputes on the spot. Empire-appointed inspectors checking that measures are honest and prices fair. For the Mexica state regulates its commerce with the same rigor it applies to its calendar. Zilonen has been taught, since she was old enough to speak, the particular formal, deferential speech expected of a well-raised girl addressing an elder or a stranger. Nahuatl carries, built into its very grammar, a whole architecture of respect and humility that every child is drilled in relentlessly. Because a disrespectful child was considered, in Mexica moral thought, one of the gravest failures a household could produce. At home that evening, when the family gathers to eat, the tortillas citlalmina ground that morning. A stew of beans and squash flavored with chili, perhaps a few insects gathered from the lake reeds. A delicacy rich in the protein a mostly vegetable diet otherwise lacked. Ocolotl will mention, as ordinary news rather than anything remarkable, that tomorrow's ceremony at the great temple is expected to be a large one, captives having been brought back in numbers from the recent campaign. Zilonen will ask if they might go and watch. Her mother will say yes, if the morning's grinding is finished in time. This is the detail easiest to lose in any telling of the Templo Mayor's altars. That the ordinary machinery of this empire, the grinding stones, the chinampas, the tribute rolls, the market inspectors, a 9-year-old girl learning the polite words for a trade of mats, was not somehow separate from the sacrifices happening a few streets away. It was the reason those sacrifices were considered necessary at all. The debt being paid at the summit of the pyramid was, in the plainest sense, the Mexica themselves would have recognized, a debt incurred on behalf of exactly this, the tortillas, the beans, the maize ripening on the chinampa, the ordinary continuance of 10,000 mornings just like this one. Above the noise of the market and the grinding stones, in a chamber attached to the palace complex where the great speaker himself resides, a different kind of priest keeps a different kind of vigil. These are not the blade bearers who serve at the summit of the Templo Mayor. They are the tonalpulque, the readers of days, astronomer priests trained for decades in the movements of the sky, custodians of the sacred calendar that governs every festival, every sacrifice, every marriage date, every decision of state significant enough to require the gods' approval. Their instruments are simple by latest standards, crossed sticks for sighting the horizon, careful nightly observation recorded across generations, a memory trained to hold and transmit numbers with a precision writing alone would later make to seem almost effortless. Their results were not. Mexica astronomers tracked the synodic period of Venus, its cycle of appearing as morning star, vanishing and returning as evening star, to within a fraction of a day of the true figure. A level of accuracy European astronomers, working with instruments the Mexica had never seen, would not achieve for another 100 years. It is this class of priest, more than the blade bearers, whom the empire's rulers consult before any major undertaking. The great speaker himself, in this era, Moctezuma II, 9th to hold the title, ruler of an empire stretching from the Gulf Coast to the Pacific, from the deserts of the north to the borders of the Maya lands in the south, does not act without their counsel. His palace, which Spanish visitors arriving within Moctezuma's own reign would later describe with something close to disbelief, houses not only his court and his wives and his personal guard, but an entire menagerie of animals gathered as tribute from across the empire's ecological range: jaguars, eagles, venomous snakes kept in pits and cages, tended by a permanent staff whose sole occupation is the animal's care, alongside a library of painted books, a garden of medicinal and ornamental plants gathered from every conquered province, and rooms set aside entirely for scholars, poets, and historians retained at state expense to keep the empire's memory in order. Moctezuma rules through a council. Not alone, the Tlacocan, a body of senior nobles and generals whose consent shapes every major decision, and beneath it a vast administrative structure of governors, tax collectors, judges, and military officers stretching down through every conquered province, most of which retain their own local rulers, their own gods, their own customs, bound to Tenochtitlan not by direct occupation, but by tribute and the standing threat of the army that could, and periodically did, return to enforce it. It is, in structure, if not in aesthetic, an empire that a Roman administrator would have recognized instantly: indirect rule, extracted tribute, a capital that dazzles precisely so that provincial visitors return home and report accurately that resistance would be pointless. And yet, in these years, something sits uneasily beneath the machinery's usual confidence. The Tonalpoka have begun reporting signs in the sky that trouble even priests trained to read troubling signs calmly. A great comet blazing across the night for weeks at a stretch, lightning striking a temple roof from a clear and stormless sky, and the fire that followed refusing for a strange stretch of time to be put out by water thrown against it. Reports, whispered more than officially recorded, of a woman's voice heard weeping in the night through empty streets, crying words that translate roughly across every account that preserves them. My children, we must go far away. Sahagun's Nahua informants, decades after the fact, would gather these signs into a list remembered as the 8 omens of the conquest. And however much of that list was shaped afterward by hindsight's cruel gift for finding meaning in coincidence, the unease it reflects was, by every account, genuinely felt in these years by a court whose entire worldview rested on the belief that the sky spoke reliably to those trained to listen. Moctezuma is reported to have consulted his priests and his rivals' priests alike, to have sent artists to render in painted images whatever the reports described, so that he might study them himself. He finds no comfort in what he is shown. None of it stops the empire's ordinary business. The tribute rolls are still kept, the chinampas are still tended. The drums at the Templo Mayor will sound again tomorrow, as they have every day of Moctezuma's reign. But somewhere in the House of Darkness, among men trained across their whole lives to read the future in the careful movement of points of light across a black sky, a question is beginning to form that none of their calculations have ever had to answer before. What happens when the debt comes due to a creditor no one has ever met? In a small chamber attached to the Templo Mayor, lit only by a single smoking torch, a young priest named Itzcoatl, no relation to the emperor of the same name 3 generations past, kneels before a stone image of Huitzilopochtli and draws a Magi spine slowly across his own tongue. Has done this every day for 11 years. It no longer surprises him that it still hurts. The priesthood of the Mexica is not a retreat from the world. It is one of its most demanding disciplines, a life measured out in penance, in sleeplessness, in a body deliberately and repeatedly broken so that its pain might be offered upward. A small installment against the great debt owed to the gods. Priests rise at midnight to bathe in the freezing lake, whatever the season. They fast for days at a time. They pierce their earlobes, their thighs, their tongues with the spines of the maguey plant or the honed edge of an obsidian blade, drawing their own blood into strips of bark paper that are later burned as offerings, the smoke carrying the sacrifice up toward the sky the way incense carries a prayer. Itzcoatl remembers the day he was given to the Kalmakak, the priestly school, at 7 years old. His mother had wept, though she tried to hide it because it was considered an honor, and honors were not to be mourned. He remembers the cold stone floor where the novices slept. He remembers the older priests, their long hair matted and black with the dried blood of 1,000 small penances, their bodies lean from fasting, their eyes carrying an expression he did not understand then and understands completely now. The particular, hollowed calm of men who have made peace with pain as a permanent condition of being alive. He was taught the Tonalpohualli, the sacred calendar of 260 days, each one governed by a different combination of gods and numbers, each one carrying its own fortune or warning. He was taught the great cycle of 52 years in which the sacred calendar and the solar year finally, briefly, align, a convergence so dangerous, so heavy with the possibility of the world's ending that an entire ceremony exists to survive it. And he will see that ceremony, if the gods allow it, only once or twice in his life. He was taught the songs of creation, sung in the ancient formal speech reserved for sacred things, songs that describe the death of Nanahuatzin and the sacrifice of the gods at Teotihuacan in language so beautiful it does not feel like language at all, more like the sound the world made when it first came into being. He was also taught, without ceremony, without softening, exactly what his hands would eventually be asked to do. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a boy the first time he understands, fully, not as an abstraction but as a fact about his own future, that he will someday hold a living heart in his hand. Itzcoatl remembers that quiet. He remembers not sleeping for 3 nights afterward, not from fear exactly, but from the effort of trying to fit the fact into the shape of himself. He was 12. By 15, he had assisted. By 18, he had performed the rite alone for the first time. Hands steady, voice steady, the years of discipline finally proving their purpose, because a trembling hand does not free a heart cleanly, and a botched sacrifice was considered an offense not against the victim, but against the God who was owed a clean and honorable payment. He does not think of himself as cruel. This is perhaps the detail that later ages will find hardest to hold in the mind at the same time as the blood that the men who performed these rites believed themselves to be, in the truest sense available to them, the most responsible people in the city. Farmers grew food, warriors defended the causeways, priests kept the sun moving. Each was a labor the whole civilization depended upon, and none of them considered their labor a smaller mercy than the others. Itzcoatl finishes his morning penance, presses the bloodied bark paper to his lips, and rises. Today there is a ceremony. Today there are captives waiting in the holding rooms behind the temple, men taken in the last flower war against Tlaxcala, their faces already painted the sacred colors that mark them for the gods. He does not know their names. He has been taught not to want to know them. He walks out into the growing light, and behind him the torch gutters low in the small stone chamber, throwing his shadow long and black across the god's carved and waiting face. 2 days' march to the east, on the high plain beyond the mountains that ring the Valley of Mexico, a young man named Cuautli, Eagle, checks the binding on his wooden club and does not sleep. He is 19. He has been training for this morning since he was old enough to walk in the Telpochcali of his neighborhood, under instructors who beat discipline into boys with a patience that looked, from the outside, indistinguishable from cruelty. He has learned to throw a spear with an atlatl, a notched throwing stick that turns a human arm into something closer to a catapult. He has learned to fight with the macuahuitl, a wooden sword lined on both edges with rows of razor-sharp obsidian blades, a weapon capable of decapitating a horse, though no one in this valley has yet seen a horse and will not for a few more decades. He has learned the highest law of Mexica warfare, the one that separates this civilization's battles from almost any fought before or since. He is not marching out this morning to kill. He is marching out to capture. The war he walks toward is what later chroniclers, translating imperfectly, will call a flower war. Xochiaoyotl fought against the neighboring state of Tlaxcala, a proud and independent people who have resisted Mexica conquest for generations, protected by mountains and by an alliance the empire has, for its own reasons, chosen not to fully crush. The Mexica could, if they wished, bring the full weight of their empire down upon Tlaxcala and grind it into tribute the way they have ground down dozens of other cities. They have chosen instead something stranger and in its own way more terrible, an arrangement understood by both sides, in which war is fought not to conquer territory but to produce captives, a live and renewable harvest for the altars of both nations. Since Tlaxcala practices the same rites and needs the same offerings the Mexica do, there is a horrifying elegance to it. Total war is a knife that only cuts once. A flower, war is a field that can be planted every season. Cuautli's teachers explained the strategic logic plainly, the way a farmer might explain the necessity of leaving one field fallow. An empire this large, ringed by conquered and resentful peoples, cannot afford to let its warriors grow soft between wars, nor can it afford to actually destroy every rival, because a defeated and absorbed people stops producing tribute, stops producing captives, stops serving any further purpose beyond what it can be squeezed for once. A live rival, kept in a state of managed, ritualized conflict, produces indefinitely. It also, not incidentally, produces soldiers, because a young man cannot rise in Mexica society, cannot marry well, cannot wear the fine cotton cloaks reserved for proven warriors, cannot cut his hair in the styles that announce his rank to the whole city, until he has taken a captive of his own, alive. With his own hands, this is what Cuautli marches toward. Not glory in the way a Spanish knight, arriving on this shore in a few short decades, will understand glory. A very specific, very personal, very lethal kind of social advancement, in which the size of his prize will be measured not in the number of enemies he kills, but in the number he manages to bring home breathing. The two armies meet at dawn on the agreed field, a stretch of open ground between the two territories, and the fighting that follows is real. Men do die here. The blades are not blunted for the occasion. Blood soaks into the same dry earth as in any war fought for any reason in any age, but the technique of it is different. Warriors aim their blows to wound, to stun, to strike the legs and shoulders rather than the throat. A macuahuitl can kill in a single stroke. A skilled warrior can also use it to disable without killing, and it is this skill, not raw strength, that separates the great warriors of the Mexica from the merely brave. Cuautli sees his opening in the chaos. A Tlaxcalan warrior, younger than himself, stumbling on a loose stone, his guard dropping for half a breath. Everything Cuautli has trained for narrows into that half breath. He does not swing to kill. He drives forward, knocks the club from the boy's hand, and seizes him by the hair. The ritual gesture of capture, understood instantly and completely by everyone on the field. A sign that says in a single motion, "This one is mine now, and by the laws both our peoples share. No one may kill him but the gods." The Tlaxcalan boy stops struggling almost immediately. He knows the rules as well as Cuautli does. He has been raised inside the same understanding of what war is for. There is no shame in this world in being captured cleanly by a skilled opponent. There is only shame in being captured badly, or in dying anonymously on a field with no one to witness that you fought well. Around them, the battle continues, other captures being made, other men falling, and above it all the sun, the reason for all of it, climbs steadily higher. Indifferent, patient, waiting for its due. Cuautli leads his captive from the field by nightfall. He does not know yet that in the days ahead he will feed this boy from his own table, will speak to him with something close to tenderness, will in some strange and specific way come to think of him almost as a son, and that this tenderness will make no difference at all to what is coming. It would be easy, standing on the Mexica side of this story, to imagine Tlaxcala as its opposite, a peaceful nation victimized by a warlike neighbor, its people innocent of everything the Valley of Mexico practiced. The truth, harder and more honest, is a mirror rather than a contrast. The boy Cuautli captured that morning, whose name is Ometochtli, 2-rabbit, born on a day whose sign gave him that name in the sacred calendar shared, with only minor variation. Across nearly every nation in this part of the world, grew up in a city that would look, to an untrained eye, remarkably like the one that will soon receive him as a captive. Tlaxcala, too, is built around a great central temple precinct. Tlaxcala, too, maintains its own priesthood, trained from childhood in penance and bloodletting, its own version of the Calmacac, its own calendar priests reading the same stars by the same methods. Tlaxcala worships a broadly overlapping pantheon under sometimes different names, where the Mexica honor Huitzilopochtli above all. Tlaxcala's warriors look first to Camaxtli, a god of hunting and war whose demands on his worshippers are, in every meaningful respect, identical to those Huitzilopochtli makes of his, and Tlaxcala, too, maintains its own Tzompantli, its own wall of skulls, standing at the edge of its own central plaza, built from the remains of Mexica warriors captured in these same flower wars, fought on these same terms. Understood by both sides as a shared institution rather than a one-directional cruelty. Ometochtli did not grow up believing his people to be the gentle victims of an aggressive empire. He grew up understanding, as clearly as any young Mexica warrior, that his own city required exactly the same payment his captor's city required, extracted through exactly the same rites, and that had the battle gone differently on the field where he was taken, it might easily have been Cuautli laid across Tlaxcala's own sacrificial stone instead. His own training in the years before his capture mirrored Cuautli's precisely. The same drilling in the Macuahuitl and the Atlatl, the same instruction in the art of capturing rather than killing. The same understanding that his own path to standing and marriage within Tlaxcalan society ran through exactly the kind of battlefield capture he has now, instead, been the victim of. He has, in earlier seasons of this same ongoing arrangement, very likely fought on the other side of exactly this exchange, has perhaps himself seized a Mexica warrior by the hair on some earlier field, led him home, fed him at his own family's table, and walked with him, 11 days later, to Tlaxcala's own altar. This symmetry is not offered here to excuse what waits for Ometochtli in Tenochtitlan, and the Mexica themselves would not have understood it as an excuse, only as a fact, plainly true, requiring no particular comment. It is offered instead because it is the detail that most completely explains why neither side, across generations of this arrangement, seems to have regarded it as a special horror requiring justification. Both nations had built the same answer to the same terrifying cosmological question, independently and yet almost identically, the way two isolated peoples sometimes discover the same solution to the same problem of survival. The debt was universal in the world both these young men were raised to understand. Only the currency's exact recipient, Huitzilopochtli here, Camaxtli there, ever really changed, and Tochtli's own mother, in Tlaxcala, will not learn for some time what has become of her son. And when she does, the sources that record such moments suggest she will grieve him precisely and only as a mother would, not as a stranger to the logic that took him, but as someone who understood it completely and grieved anyway. Because understanding a thing and being able to bear it have never, in any civilization history has produced, been quite the same accomplishment. The Tlaxcalan boy's name is Ome Tochtli, 2 Rabbit, and for the 11 days between his capture and the ceremony that will end his life, he is treated, by the standards of any century, astonishingly well. This is the detail that unsettles those who first encounter it centuries later more than the blade itself. There is no dungeon. There is no starvation, no beating, no attempt to break him before the end. Cuautli, the warrior who took him, brings him into his own household, in the specific and formal role the Mexica called the captive's keeper, a relationship carrying real weight and, by every account that survives, real feeling. Ome Tochtli sleeps under a roof. He eats well, better in these final days than most commoners eat in a season. Turkey, maize cakes, chocolate reserved usually for nobility, delicacies a boy of his own rank in Tlaxcala might never otherwise taste. He is bathed. He is given fine cloth to wear. In the days before certain festivals, captives destined for particular gods are dressed in the costume and paint of that god itself, dancing through the city streets to the sound of drums, greeted by crowds not with jeers but with something closer to reverence, because for these final days the Mexica believe, with total sincerity, that the god has entered the captive's body, that the man walking among them is no longer only a man. Ome Tochtli understands what is coming. No one hides it from him, and no one expects him to be surprised by it. Hiding it would, in the moral logic of this world, be a kind of insult, a suggestion that he could not be trusted to meet his own death with the dignity his warrior's training prepared him for. In Tlaxcala, as the previous chapter has already made plain, he was raised on the same stories the Mexica were, believed in gods that demanded the same debts, and would have led captives of his own to the same altars in his own city's temples. On days when the fighting went the other way, there are nights, in the small room where he sleeps in Cuautli's household, when the two of them talk, through the strained, halting understanding of neighboring dialects, through gesture, through the shared vocabulary the two warriors trained in the same broader tradition of combat and honor can always find. Cuautli asks about Tlaxcala. Ome Tochtli asks about the temple, about how it will be done, whether it will be quick. Cuautli, who has watched the rite performed many times, tells him what he knows, plainly, because a lie would be its own kind of dishonor between them now. Sources set down generations later by Spanish friars working with Nahua informants, men like Bernardino de Sahagún, who spent decades interviewing Mexica elders determined to preserve their world before it vanished entirely from memory. Describe this custom of feasting and honoring the doomed captive not as an anomaly, but as the norm, woven through nearly every account of the sacrificial rite that survives. It is, perhaps, the single hardest thing about this civilization for a later age to hold in the mind without flinching away, that the extraordinary tenderness shown to Ome Tochtli in these 11 days is not a contradiction of what will happen to him at their end. It is a part of the same unbroken logic. A great gift must be a costly one. A captive fed on scraps and treated with contempt would be, in the calculus of this religion, a cheap offering, an insult to the god who receives him. Ome Tochtli is being fattened not out of guilt, and not despite what is coming, but because of it. The finer the guest, the greater the honor paid to the god who will finally, formally receive him. On the 9th night, there is a feast in Cuautli's household in Ome Tochtli's honor, attended by the warrior's family and neighbors. And Ome Tochtli, dressed now in fine cloth, a garland of flowers at his throat, is seated in the place of highest respect. He eats well. He is given cacao to drink, sweetened and spiced, a luxury few commoners in either nation taste more than a handful of times in a life. There is music. There is, by every surviving account of such feasts, something that can only honestly be called warmth in the room. A warmth extended, without apparent irony, toward a boy who has perhaps 12 days left to live, by the very people who will walk him to the temple stairs. Ome Tochtli sits at the center of it, garlanded, fed, honored, and does not know, cannot know, has no way within his entire understanding of the world to know that 4 decades from this night, ships will appear on the eastern sea carrying men from a country he has never heard of, who worship a single god nailed to a wooden cross, who will look at everything happening in this room tonight and see only butchery, and who will use the horror of it, honestly felt and cynically deployed in equal measure, to help burn this entire world to the ground. Tonight, none of that has happened yet. Tonight, there is only the feast, the flowers, the firelight, and a boy eating chocolate from a bowl, 3 days before he will climb a pyramid to keep the sun in the sky. On the last night, no one sleeps. Ome Tochtli is taken from Quautli's household before dawn and led, along with the other captives destined for tomorrow's rite, 6 men in total, taken in the same flower war, from Tlaxcala and from Huexotzinco beyond it, to a chamber within the temple precinct where the priests keep their vigil. The city around them has already begun to gather. Word of a great ceremony travels through Tenochtitlan, the way water finds every low place in a field. By the time the sky begins to gray in the east, the plazas around the Templo Mayor are filling with people who have walked from every district of the island and from towns along the lakeshore, drawn by an event that is, in this civilization, simultaneously religious observance, civic duty, political theater, and, however strange the word sits beside everything else true of the occasion, entertainment, in the oldest and most total sense of that word, the way a coronation or a great trial might draw a crowd in another age. Inside the chamber, Itzcoatl and the other priests perform the final preparations. The captives are bathed once more. Their bodies are painted, some in the white and red stripes marking them for Huitzilopochtli, some in other colors for other gods being honored in tomorrow's cycle of the calendar. For the Mexica ritual year is crowded with festivals, nearly one for every 18-day month, each demanding its own offerings to its own patron among the vast and crowded family of Mexica gods. Ome Tochtli's hair is arranged, ornaments placed at his ears and wrists. He is given, one final time, food and drink, and though the accounts that survive do not agree on whether captives ate heartily or barely at all in these last hours, they agree on this: no one forced the food on him, no one needed to. Whatever fear moved through him in that room, it moved beneath a discipline instilled since childhood. A warrior's discipline that held terror was not a thing to be denied, only a thing not to be shown. There is a moment, recorded in fragments across several of the surviving accounts, when captives were permitted, even encouraged, to speak. Some sang. Some are recorded to have delivered long, formal speeches to the priests and nobles gathered to witness the vigil, speeches about their homeland, their families, the manner of their capture, composed in the elevated, formal register of Nahuatl oratory that every noble child was trained in from youth. On both sides of the border, between empire and rival, it was considered, in this world, the mark of a truly great captive that he could face the last night of his life and produce something like poetry from it. Ome Tochtli does not know if he will manage that. He sits instead in a silence that Itzcoatl, watching from across the chamber, recognizes, has seen it in 100 captives across 11 years of service, as neither despair nor peace, but something harder to name, a kind of concentrated attention, as if the boy is trying to hold every remaining sensation of being alive in his hands at once before it is taken from him. The 5 men beside him carry the night differently, each according to his own temperament, and Itzcoatl has learned across his years of service that no 2 vigils ever look quite alike, whatever the ritual's outward uniformity suggests to those watching from outside it. One of the Huexotzinco captives, older than the rest, a man who has clearly already buried the worst of his fear somewhere the priests cannot see, spends the night in low conversation with the guard assigned to him, asking after the man's own family with what looks, disconcertingly, like genuine curiosity. Another, younger even than Ome Toktli, weeps without shame for a portion of the night, and no one in the chamber moves to stop him or shame him for it. Grief, in this room, is not confused with cowardice, and a captive who wept was not thought less capable of dying well than one who did not. A third sings, quietly at first and then with more confidence as the hours pass, an old song from his own home valley that none of the Mexica priests recognize, and Itzcotl, listening, finds himself struck by the strange fact that a melody built for an entirely different purpose in an entirely different life is, tonight, doing exactly the same work the temple's own ritual songs are doing a few walls away, carrying a person steadily toward something no song has ever actually prepared anyone to meet. Outside, torches are being lit along the temple stairways, hundreds of them, until the Great Pyramid stands lit from base to summit against the dark sky like a mountain on fire. Musicians take up positions around the plaza, drums of hollowed wood and stretched hide, conch shell trumpets, flutes carved from bone, and begin a low, steady rhythm that will not stop until well after sunrise. A sound that the chroniclers who heard its like described without exception as beautiful, and as one of the most disturbing beautiful things they had ever heard. Somewhere in the city, Quauhtli stands among the gathering crowd, his own family beside him, waiting to watch the culmination of the captive he raised, fed, and came to love in the strange grammar this civilization had built for exactly that kind of love. He does not think of what is coming as a loss. He has been raised to think of it as the completion of an obligation he undertook the moment he seized Ome Toktli by the hair on that battlefield, a debt owed not to Ome Toktli, but through him to the sun that had not yet failed to rise in Quauhtli's lifetime, and that Quauhtli intends, so far as his own hands can ensure it, to keep from failing in the future. In the temple chamber, Itzcotl begins the final prayers. His voice, low and practiced, fills the small stone room, and Ome Toktli, dressed now fully in the sacred colors, sits and listens to a language he has known since childhood describe, in the oldest words this world possesses, the precise shape of what tomorrow will ask of him. The torches burn down. The drums do not stop, and somewhere beyond the mountains, unhurried, indifferent to every prayer being offered in its name, the sun continues its slow approach toward the horizon, exactly as it has every morning since Nanahuatzin threw himself into the fire at Teotihuacan and did not come back. The sun clears the eastern peaks a little after the hour the Mexica mark as the beginning of the day, and the plaza before the Templo Mayor is, by now, packed with more people than most European cities of this same year hold within their entire walls. Ome Toktli is led from the holding chamber in a procession with the other 5 captives, priests walking before and beside them, the drums and conch shells rising in volume as they emerge into the light. The crowd does not jeer. It does not scream for blood in the manner later ages will imagine, informed more by Roman amphitheaters than by anything Mexica sources actually describe. What the accounts consistently record instead is closer to solemnity, a vast, reverent hush threaded through with ritual song, broken by the steady pulse of drums, the crowd understanding, itself not as spectators at an execution but as witnesses to a transaction between their city and the forces that kept it alive. The procession crosses the plaza toward the base of the great stairway. The western face, painted deep red, dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, the god whose hunger, more than any others, shapes this entire civilization's relationship to war and the sun alike. The stairway rises before them at a steep, almost punishing angle, over 100 narrow steps climbing more than 40 meters into the brightening sky. And Ome Toktli, at the base of it, looks up. Accounts differ, and honesty requires holding that uncertainty rather than resolving it for the sake of a cleaner story, on whether captives climbed those stairs under their own power or were half carried, half dragged by attending priests. Some sources describe captives ascending proudly, unassisted, as a final demonstration of the warrior's discipline that had defined their whole short lives. Others describe drugs, an infusion sometimes given beforehand to dull terror, to still trembling limbs, to ensure the ceremony proceeded with the calm the gods were owed, rather than the chaos of a man fighting for his life at the summit. Both may be true on different days for different men in a ritual practiced across 3 centuries and dozens of festivals a year. What is certain is only this: Ome Toctli reaches the top. At the summit stands the small shrine to Huitzilopochtli, and before it, the Tecatl, a stone block, slightly convex, positioned so that a body laid across it arches backward, chest lifted toward the sky, exposed and ready. Around it wait 5 priests in addition to its Kotl, each with a designated task in a rite so old and so often repeated that every motion has been worn smooth of hesitation. The way water wears a channel into stone, Ome Toctli is laid across the block. 4 priests take his limbs, a wrist and an ankle each, and hold him still, not roughly, but with the total, practiced firmness of men who understand that any struggle in these final seconds serves no one, least of all the captive himself, whose honor depends on stillness the way a warrior's honor in battle depended on skill. Its Kotl steps forward, holding the ceremonial knife, its blade of obsidian, black and volcanic glass sharp, honed to an edge finer than the steel that will arrive on this coast within Ome Toctli's own children's lifetimes, had he been permitted children. He raises it. He speaks briefly the ritual words ode to Huitzilopochtli, the same words spoken over every captive laid on this stone across generations, an offering of thanks and of obligation fulfilled. Then, in a single practiced motion, the blade opens the chest below the ribs, and its Kotl's hand, trained across 11 years for precisely this instant, reaches into the wound and closes around the heart. It does not stop beating immediately. This detail, recorded again and again by observers across the centuries who found it the hardest single fact to set down, is central to the entire meaning of the rite, not incidental to it. The heart, still contracting, still warm, still visibly, unmistakably alive, is lifted toward the sky, held high enough for the crowd below to see, offered directly to the sun climbing above the eastern mountains, as though presenting it with proof. Here is what was promised. Here is the payment. Only then is it placed in the stone vessel, the Quoxicali, carved often in the shape of an eagle, the sun's own creature, kept at the summit to receive exactly this offering. Ome Toctli's body, its heart taken, is released by the 4 priests and rolled, or in some accounts pushed with deliberate ceremony, down the steep face of the stairway, tumbling the full 100+ steps to the plaza below, where other attendants wait to receive it. A final descent that is not, within the ritual's own logic, a desecration but a necessary completion, the body returning to earth as the heart has been offered to the sky. Each element of the sacred order finding its proper place. The smoke of copal incense hangs thick over the summit platform, sweet and resinous, mixing with the iron smell that no amount of incense has ever fully masked in all the years its Kotl has served here. Below, the crowd's low murmur of song rises and falls with the drums, thousands of voices carrying the same ancient hymn in a single wavering unison. And from this height, the whole of Tenochtitlan spreads out in every direction, the lake catching the morning light in scattered points of silver, the causeways stretching toward the mainland mountains, the Chinampa Gardens where, at this very hour, a farmer very much like Ocelotl is bent over his own maize, unaware, or perhaps simply accustomed to what is happening a few thousand paces from his furrowed plot. Its Kotl has stood at this exact spot, performed this exact motion, more times than he could number if asked, and yet some quiet, unspoken part of him, a part his 11 years of training have taught him never to examine too closely in the moment itself, still registers. Every single time, the particular warmth of a heart that has not yet understood it is no longer inside a body. At the base of the stairs, the crowd does not scatter or recoil. What waits there? The skin sometimes claimed for further ritual use by priests representing the flayed god Zipi Totek, the body itself given over, in many recorded instances, to Quatli's own household for a final ceremonial meal shared among close kin, an act the Mexica understood not as feasting on an enemy, but as the last and most intimate stage of honoring a guest who had, by the end, become something closer to family. None of it reads, from inside the civilization that practiced it, as horror. It reads as completion, a debt incurred at the dawn of this age when the gods burned themselves to give the world light, paid again, on schedule, in full, above the temple, unhurried, exactly as it has every day of Ometoctli's short life and every day before it since Nanahuatzin first rose from the fire at Teotihuacan. The sun continues to climb. It does not thank anyone. It has never once been asked to. Not every offering made in the shadow of the Templo Mayor follows the path Ometoctli walked. And to understand this civilization honestly, its other altars must be named as plainly as its greatest one. In the month the Mexica calendar calls Tlacaxipehualiztli, the flaying of men, a different god receives his due. Zeep Totec, our Lord the Flayed One, is a god of spring, of planting, of the agonizing but necessary process by which a seed must split itself open and shed its outer husk before it can grow into anything green. His rites are built directly from that metaphor, made unbearably literal. Captives are sacrificed as Ometoctli was, and their skins, removed afterward by the officiating priests, are worn by living men, often priests themselves. Sometimes the warriors who made the original capture, for the full 20 days of the festival that follows, a costume of human hide that dries and stiffens and yellows as the days pass, worn as a visible, walking symbol of the new skin the earth itself will soon put on as the planting season begins. It is among the practices later ages find hardest to look at directly, and the Mexica themselves did not soften it. They built their agriculture's most sacred season around an image of literal transformation through literal flaying, because to them, the metaphor and the fact were never separate things to begin with. There is also the rite the Spanish would later call the gladiatorial sacrifice, Tlahuahuanalistli, a name that translates, roughly, to the striping for the wounds it leaves. Here, unlike the swift ascent Ometoctli made, a single elite captive, chosen specifically for his skill and courage in battle, is bound at the ankle by a rope to a massive round sacrificial stone in the plaza, and given weapons, a macuahuitl edged not with obsidian but with soft feathers, useless for real combat, to face, in succession, a series of Mexica's finest warriors armed with their true obsidian-lined blades. It is not by any honest measure a fair contest. But it is not meant to be a contest of survival. It is meant to be a stage on which the captive's courage can be displayed to the entire city, wound after wound, fall after fall, until at last he is finished and carried, exhausted and bleeding, to the same stone altar the rite always ends upon. Chronicled instances exist of captives fighting with such ferocity, even armed with feathers against obsidian, that they wounded or nearly killed their opponents before finally being brought down. Men whose names were remembered afterward, sung about, held up as models of the warrior's ideal that every young man in the city, watching from the crowd, had been raised since childhood to aspire to. And there is Tlaloc, the rain god, oldest of all the gods in this valley, older even than the Mexica's own arrival here, worshipped in this land since long before their ancestors first saw the eagle on the cactus. Tlaloc's rites are, by nearly every surviving account, the hardest of all to set down without flinching, because Tlaloc's chosen offerings, in the months when drought threatened the maize and the whole city's survival hung on rain that had not yet come, were children, young, unblemished, often purchased from families in exchange for goods, sometimes offered by families themselves, as a supreme act of devotion in a worldview where a child's death for the good of the whole community was not the unthinkable. Horror later centuries would insist it must have been, but a legible, if agonizing, form of civic sacrifice. Sahagun's Nahua informants told him, decades after the conquest, that the tears of these children were considered essential to the rite's success, that priests believed a weeping child was a sign the rains themselves would soon weep down upon the fields, and that children who did not cry were considered troubling omens, their handlers sometimes causing them pain deliberately to produce the tears the ritual required. It is worth pausing on this, honestly, rather than rushing past it toward some gentler part of the story. No framework of cultural context, no explanation of cosmology or agricultural desperation makes this comfortable to read, and it should not. The Mexica themselves did not pretend it was comfortable. Their own poetry is threaded with grief for the children given to Tlaloc, verses that mourn even as they justify, that hold sorrow and necessity in the same breath without resolving the tension between them. This is, perhaps, the truest window available into how this civilization understood itself, not as monsters who felt nothing, but as people who felt everything and built an entire cosmology to make that feeling survivable, generation after generation, harvest after harvest, because the alternative, in their understanding, was not a world without sacrifice. It was no world at all. There is one further category of offering that belonged not to the priesthood or the battlefield, but to the marketplace, and it reveals just how completely the logic of debt and payment had saturated every layer of Mexica life. The pochtesa, the long-distance merchants who guided trading caravans deep into hostile and unconquered territory, carrying featherwork and obsidian tools south toward the Maya lands and returning with jade, cacao, and jaguar pelts, occupied a strange and privileged position in Mexica society, wealthy enough to rival the lesser nobility, yet formally ranked among the commoners. Attention the Pochteca managed partly through deliberate modesty in public and partly through spectacular, private displays of exactly the kind of piety the empire prized most. At the great festival of Panquetzalistli, held in the depths of the dry season in Huitzilopochtli's honor, the wealthiest merchants would purchase and prepare a bathed slave, a Tlacochtli, with the same lavish feasting, fine cloth, and ceremonial honor shown to a war captive like Ome Tochtli, before offering him at a private rite that served, quite openly, a dual purpose, genuine religious devotion, and an unmistakable public announcement of the sponsoring merchant's wealth, generosity, and standing broadcast to guests, neighbors, and rivals alike. The Pochteca traveled roads no army patrolled, carried goods no ordinary household could afford, and in the end paid the same debt every other class of Mexica society paid, simply denominated as merchants tend to denominate most things, in a currency they alone were wealthy enough to spend freely. At the edge of the temple precinct, visible from nearly every approach to the plaza, stands the tzompantli, the skull rack. It is not a metaphor, and it is not hidden. It is a wooden frame built on a stone platform, strung with row upon row of human skulls, pierced through the temples and threaded onto horizontal poles, each row above the last, climbing until the whole structure holds, by the estimate of archaeologists who would, 5 centuries later, excavate its stone foundation platform beneath the modern streets of Mexico City and find it stacked with skulls set in mortar, arranged with the same deliberate care given to any other sacred structure. Thousands upon thousands of the dead, a permanent, visible, and entirely intentional monument to how many debts this city has paid. To understand the Tzompantli only as an ossuary is to miss most of what it was built to do. It stood exactly where every visitor to Tenochtitlan, every tribute bearer from a conquered province, every foreign ambassador, every merchant arriving from a rival city that had not yet been folded into the empire, would see it first before anything else the city had to offer. This was not incidental. Later scholars examining the skulls recovered from its foundations would find something else revealing embedded in the bone itself. Evidence, from isotope analysis of teeth and jaw, that a significant number of the dead displayed had not been raised within Tenochtitlan or even within its immediate territories, but had traveled, some of them quite far, before their deaths, consistent with tribute captives, war captives, purchased slaves brought from distant provinces specifically to be offered here. At the empire's own front door, the Tzompantli, in other words, was doing at least 2 things at once, and both were true simultaneously without contradiction in the minds of the people who built and maintained it. It was a genuinely sacred structure, an offering place as real and as reverent to Mexica eyes as the summit of the Great Pyramid itself. And it was a message, unmistakable and deliberately displayed, aimed at every foreign eye that passed beneath it. This is what happens to those who resist us. This is the scale on which we operate. Measure your own city's walls against this one before you decide to test them. This is the detail that resists easy sorting into either of the 2 stories later ages have told themselves about the Mexica, the story of noble, misunderstood philosopher-priests practicing a spirituality too subtle for European eyes to comprehend, or the story of mindless, bloodthirsty savages awaiting rescue by more civilized conquerors. Neither survives contact with the Tzompantli intact. What stands there instead is something closer to the truth of most empires that have ever existed. Stripped of the comfortable distance history usually grants them, a state that had built genuine religious conviction and cold political calculation into the very same structure, Inseparably, because in the world the Mexica inhabited, there had never been a meaningful difference between the two. A god that needed feeding and an empire that needed obedience turned out, in Tenochtitlan, to want exactly the same thing, delivered by exactly the same hand, on exactly the same stairway. Historians, centuries later, would argue bitterly over the numbers, whether the reported sacrifices at events like the 1487 rededication of the Templo Mayor under the ruler Ahuitzotl, described in some later colonial-era chronicles as running into the tens of thousands over 4 days, reflect genuine Mexica record-keeping or the exaggerations of Spanish writers eager to justify a conquest already accomplished by other means. The honest answer, available evidence suggests, sits somewhere between the two extremes. The true annual scale of Mexica's sacrifice across the empire, while almost certainly far smaller than the most inflated colonial figures claim, was nonetheless substantial and sustained, embedded so deeply into the calendar's structure, nearly every 18-day month carrying its own required offerings to its own patron god, that it could not have been, by any honest accounting, a rare or occasional practice. It was infrastructure, as regular, as expected, and as woven into the ordinary function of the state as tax collection or the maintenance of the causeways. Beneath the Tzompantli's shadow, the market continues. Traders haggle over cacao and cotton. Children run between the stalls. Life, ordinary and continuous, and largely indifferent, unfolds in full view of thousands of the dead, because to the people living beneath that wall of skulls, the dead were not an interruption of ordinary life. They were one of its load-bearing walls. Not every death this civilization sanctified happened on a temple stairway, and not every warrior the Mexica honored was a man who had marched to war. When a woman in Tenochtitlan discovered she was carrying her first child, a midwife was summoned to speak to her a set of formal words, preserved by Sahagun's informants in careful detail, that framed the pregnancy ahead of her in language no gentler than the language used to send a young man off to his first campaign. Childbirth, in Mexica thought, was war. The child inside her was described, in the midwife's ritual speech, as a captive she must fight to bring into the world, and the mother herself as a warrior facing an enemy as real and as lethal as any army, which was not metaphor so much as plain observation. In an age when death in childbirth claimed women at a rate that made the delivery room as dangerous, in cold statistical terms, as the battlefield Cuautli marched across, if a woman died in this struggle, in the act of capturing her child, as the ritual language put it, she was not mourned as a tragic accident. She was honored as a fallen warrior, granted a fate the Mexica considered equal in glory to any man's death in battle, where warriors who died fighting or on the sacrificial stone were believed to join Tonatiuh's escort for the first half of each day, guiding the sun from its dawn rising to its zenith at noon. Women who died bringing forth life were believed to become the Chihuateteo, women gods, who took up the sun's escort for its second half, guiding it from noon down to its setting in the west, a duty considered no less essential to the world's continued turning than the warrior's morning shift. The Cihuateteo were not, in Mexica belief, gentle spirits. They were feared, honored at crossroads shrines with real trepidation, said to haunt the night sky at the points where roads met, capable of causing illness in children or madness in the men unlucky enough to cross their path after dark. This, too, was consistent with the honor paid them rather than a contradiction of it. In a cosmology built entirely from reciprocal debts and dangerous, necessary power, a spirit gentle enough to pose no threat to anyone would hardly have been considered a spirit worth fearing, worshipping, or trusting with half the sun's daily journey. Beyond the specific danger of childbirth, women's ordinary labor was itself woven into the same sacred vocabulary that governed the warrior's path and the priest's penance. When a daughter was born, the midwife's ritual words for her were markedly different from those spoken over a newborn son, not a call to war, but a description of the loom, the spindle, the grinding stone, framed with the same seriousness and the same expectation of lifelong discipline the boy's speech carried. Weaving, in particular, held a status in Mexica religious thought that a purely practical reading of cloth-making entirely misses. Myths describe the very fabric of creation using the vocabulary of the loom. and a woman skilled at weaving complex patterns was understood to be exercising a kind of creative power directly analogous to the God's own original acts of making. Marriage itself was arranged with the same calendar-driven care given to any major undertaking of state, a date selected by the tonal puka for its auspicious sign, the ceremony built around the literal tying together of the bride's and groom's cloaks, a knot that gave the Spanish, watching centuries later, their own borrowed phrase for marriage's beginning. Noble women might be married for alliance in unions arranged as coldly as any European royal match. Common women married within their own kalpuli, their own neighborhood ward, more often for compatibility and labor partnership than for political gain. In households where the wife's economic contribution, weaving, market trade, the management of the household stores was neither small nor unrecognized, it would be a mistake to romanticize any of this into an equality later centuries would recognize. Mexica women could not become priests of the highest orders, could not sit on the Tlayacapan Council, could not lead armies, but it would be an equal mistake to read their world only through that absence and to miss the specific, considerable, and genuinely sacred authority the Mexica did grant them. Girls as well as boys could be given over to temple service, entering as Cihuatlamacasque, young women who lived for a period within the temple precincts, sweeping the sacred courtyards at dawn, weaving the cloth used to dress the gods' images, tending the incense braziers whose smoke carried prayers upward alongside the blood offered on the stairs above them. It was not the priesthood of the blade that Itzcotl belonged to, and it carried none of that office's ultimate authority, but it was understood as sacred labor nonetheless, a service owed and honored in its own right. Beyond the temple, individual women built considerable local reputations and real influence as healers, tepatiani, versed in an extensive pharmacology of local plants, skilled in setting bones, treating fevers, and easing the passage of childbirth itself. Their knowledge passed mother to daughter across generations with the same careful, disciplined transmission that carried a priest's calendar training or a warrior's swordcraft down through his own line. This authority, an authority woven, quite literally, into the same sun that every captive on the Templo Mayor's stairway believed himself to be keeping in motion, was one that Mexica women believed with no less conviction. They themselves helped carry across half of every single sky. There is one ceremony that dwarfs all others, that the entire calendar exists in anticipation of, and that most who live through it will witness at most, once or perhaps twice across an entire lifetime. It is called the Toxiuchmolpilia, the binding of the years, and it falls due only once every 52 years, at the single point where the two great calendars the Mexica keep, the 260-day sacred count and the 365-day solar year, finally realign after circling one another like two gears of different sizes, each returning at last to the exact configuration from which they began. To a civilization that reads meaning into every conjunction of number and time, this convergence is not a curiosity. It is the single most dangerous moment the world regularly produces, a seam in the fabric of creation, a point at which the fifth sun's continued existence is not merely symbolically, but literally in question. The Mexica believe, with the same unshaken certainty that shapes every other part of their cosmology, that at the end of each 52-year cycle, the sun may simply fail to rise again. Not metaphorically, not eventually, that very dawn. In the days leading up to it, the entire empire prepares as though for a siege against an enemy that cannot be seen or bargained with. Every fire in every household, every temple, every workshop across the whole of the valley is extinguished, the hearths gone cold, the temple braziers gone dark for the first time in living memory. An entire civilization sitting deliberately in darkness. Old pottery is smashed, household idols are cast aside, clothes are discarded, the streets are swept clean of the accumulated dust of the dying cycle, as though the city itself is being stripped bare, made ready to begin again from nothing. Should it survive the night, pregnant women are hidden away, locked inside storehouses with their faces painted blue, because it is believed that if the world does end tonight, women carrying children risk being transformed into monsters, into the same Tsitsimime. The star demons who wait always. at the edges of creation for exactly this kind of failure. Children are kept awake by their parents through the entire night, faces painted, mouths held open at intervals, out of a belief that a sleeping child at this precise threshold risks turning into a mouse before dawn. No one in the city sleeps this night. No one is permitted to. At the summit of a hill outside Tenochtitlan called Huixachtecatl, the Hill of the Star, the high priests gather in the deep dark before dawn, dressed in the regalia of the gods themselves. Arranged in careful order behind a priest costumed as Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, watching the sky for a single star cluster, the Pleiades to reach its zenith directly overhead. This is the appointed instant. There is no room for error in the timing, and no way to delay it if the priests are not ready when the moment comes. A final captive, chosen with the same care and, if the surviving accounts are to be trusted, treated in the preceding days with the same strange honor Ometeotli received before him, is laid upon a sacrificial stone atop the hill, and his heart is taken exactly as it has been taken on 10,000 ordinary days before this one. But this time, in the open wound of his chest, the officiating priest kindles a new flame, using a wooden fire drill spun by hand against a wooden base, working the friction alone, with the entire watching empire's fate resting on whether the spark catches. If it does not catch, if the friction fails, if the wood is too damp, if the priest's hands falter at the one moment in his entire life when they cannot be permitted to, the Mexica believe there will be no second attempt, no correction, no mercy. The Tzitsimimi will descend from the darkness at the sky's edge and devour what remains of the world before the sun can rise again. It does catch. It has caught, according to the accounts that survive, at every recorded instance of this ceremony across Mexica history, successfully performed in the years 1351, 1403, 1455, and the last time before the world this city is built comes to its own unrelated and unforeseen end. In the year 1507, under the Emperor Moctezuma II, a bare 12 years before ships no priest's fire drill could have prepared this empire for arrive on the eastern coast. When the new flame catches, it does not stay contained to the hilltop. Runners have been stationed in relay along the causeways and roads leading back into the city and out across the whole valley, and the fire is passed from torch to torch, carried at a dead run through the darkness, kindling first the great brazier atop the Templo Mayor itself, then spreading outward, household to household, temple to temple, until every hearth that went cold days before is burning again, and the entire valley, watched by a sun that has, once more, agreed to return, erupts into celebration, new clothes put on, feasts prepared, pulque poured, the terror of the preceding days transformed in a single sunrise, into a relief so total it borders on ecstasy. The world has been renewed. The debt has been paid at its highest possible rate of interest, and somewhere in the crowd celebrating below Huixachtecatl, a child too young to remember the last binding of the years watches the new fire arrive at the hearth of her own home for the first time in her life, and understands, without anyone needing to explain it further, exactly what she has just watched her civilization survive. What happened to Ometeotli's heart, lifted toward the sun and set into the stone vessel at the summit of the Templo Mayor, was only half the question the Mexica believed his death answered. The other half was where the rest of him, the part that was not blood and muscle, the part that had spoken with Cuautli in the dark of the last 11 nights, would go next. It is here that the Mexica understanding of death diverges most sharply from the one that would soon arrive with the Spanish, and the divergence is worth sitting with, because it explains something the sacrifices themselves cannot explain alone. Why a captive could walk to his death not merely resigned, but in some genuine sense hopeful. In the Christian cosmology approaching this coast, the destination of a soul is decided by the moral quality of the life that preceded it, virtue rewarded, sin punished, a ledger kept and finally balanced at judgment. The Mexica kept no such ledger. Where a soul went after death had almost nothing to do with whether the person who died had been kind, honest, or devout. It had to do almost entirely with the manner of the dying itself. Most people, the overwhelming majority, farmers and weavers and merchants and priests alike, who died of old age, illness, or the 1,000 ordinary accidents of a pre-modern life, were believed to travel to Mictlan, the land of the dead, a cold, dim, and and difficult place ruled by the skeletal god Mictlantecutli and his consort Mictecacihuatl. The journey there was not instantaneous and not gentle. The Mexica believed it took 4 full years, across 9 distinct and increasingly difficult levels, a place where 2 mountains threatened to crush the traveler between them, a wind that cut like obsidian knives, a river that had to be crossed with the help of a small red-furred dog, which is why families kept and, when they could, sacrificed a xoloitzcuintli quintly at a person's funeral, so that the animal's spirit might wait on the far bank and guide its owner safely across the water that human souls alone could not swim. It was not a punishment, this long, gray, difficult road. It was simply what an ordinary death purchased, an ordinary afterlife. Muted and effortful, matching in its texture the plain, unremarkable manner of the life and death that led there. But a handful of deaths were considered so significant, so directly entangled with the sacred forces that kept the world moving, that they bought passage somewhere else entirely, those who died by water, drowning. Certain diseases the Mexica associated with excess fluid, such as dropsy, being struck by lightning, or any of the deaths understood to fall under Tlaloc's particular domain, were believed to travel not to the gray difficulty of Mictlan, but to Tlalocan, a paradise of permanent green, described in surviving songs as a place of endless spring, where maize grew without labor, where flowers never wilted, where the dead who arrived there spent eternity in a garden that the hardest-working Chinampa farmer in Tenochtitlan could only dream of tending. It was, in its way, a small mercy folded into an otherwise unforgiving cosmology. The very deaths that seemed most senseless and cruel by water's hand were the ones the gods had set aside their gentlest reward for. And then there was the destination reserved for exactly 2 groups, and only 2. Warriors who died in battle or upon the sacrificial stone, and women who died in the struggle of childbirth. Both were believed to ascend to the house of the sun itself, Tonatiuh's own realm, sometimes called Omeocan, where for 4 years the souls of these honored dead accompanied the sun on its daily journey, the warriors carrying it from its dawn, rising to its height at noon, the women carrying it from noon down to its setting in the west. Precisely the division of labor the Chihuateteo were already understood to perform. At the end of those 4 years, the Mexica believed these fortunate souls did not fade into Mictlan's gray difficulty at all. They were transformed instead into hummingbirds and brightly feathered birds, free to spend the whole of eternity drifting among the flowers of the world they had once helped keep alive, tasting nectar in a garden with no walls at all. This is the belief that explains what would otherwise remain simply incomprehensible, why Mexica warriors spoke, without any detectable irony, of the flowery death, Xochimilquistli, as something closer to an aspiration than a fate to be avoided. Why the eagle and jaguar warrior orders, the 2 elite societies a man could rise into only after taking multiple captives in battle, wore the feathers and pelts of creatures themselves associated with the sun and the hunt as a visible declaration that they had already made their peace with exactly this ending, and considered it the finest one available to them. A warrior who died of illness in his bed, having survived every battle of his life, was in the Mexica accounting a man who had, in some sense, missed his own paradise by outliving the chance to earn it. It is this belief, more than any other single fact about Mexica religion, that reframes what happened to Ometeotli at the summit of the Templo Mayor. He did not walk those stairs believing himself only a victim, paying a debt on behalf of a city that was not his own. He walked them, so far as the sources allow any confidence at all, believing himself to be doing precisely what the finest warriors of both his nation and his captor's nation spent their whole lives training to achieve, dying the one death guaranteed by the oldest and most trusted authority his world possessed, to end not in the cold and difficult road to Mictlan, but in the service of the sun itself, and afterward, 4 years on, as a bird among an eternity of flowers. Whether that belief made the obsidian blade easier to face is a question no surviving account can answer with certainty, because no one who climbed those stairs left a record of the last few seconds behind. But it is not a small thing, in trying to understand this civilization honestly, to recognize that the men who built this system of sacrifice built, directly alongside it, one of the most genuinely comforting visions of what a difficult death could earn that any religion in human history has offered its dying. For all the blood spilled at the summit of the Templo Mayor, the deepest philosophical current running beneath Mexica's civilization was not a hunger for death. It was a grief over how little of life anyone was ever permitted to keep. The Nahuatl language, in which Ometoctli spoke his last formal words and Itzcoatl recited his oldest prayers, carried a phrase for this grief so central to Mexica, thought that scholars who later devoted their lives to recovering it treated it as close to a key for the whole civilization's inner life. In Xochitl, in Cuicatl, flower and song, it named, in a single paired image, the closest thing to truth or lasting meaning the Mexica believed a person could actually reach during a life they knew, with total certainty, would not last. A flower, because it was beautiful precisely in proportion to how briefly it lasted before wilting. A song, because it existed only in the moment of its singing, gone the instant the breath that carried it stopped. To live wisely, in Nawa philosophical thought, was to learn to hold something as fragile as a flower or a song at the center of a life you knew the sun itself might end at any binding of the years, and to find in that fragility not despair but the only kind of beauty this world actually made available. This was not vague sentiment. It was a formal, cultivated intellectual tradition argued over in the same Calmecac halls where Itzcoatl learned his penances, composed and performed at gatherings of nobles who prized a well-turned verse the way a Mexica warrior prized a well-executed capture. Rulers themselves were expected to be poets, their skill at composing and reciting verse considered as legitimate a mark of fitness to govern as their skill in war or their command of the calendar. The greatest of them, by the consistent judgment of both his own contemporaries and the scholars who later worked to preserve what survived of his words, was Nezahualcoyotl, the philosopher king of the neighboring city of Texcoco, a close ally and kinsman of the Mexica rulers of Tenochtitlan, whose poetry survives, filtered, translated, and undoubtedly altered by the long journey from spoken performance to the hands of the colonial-era scribes who eventually wrote fragments of it down as the closest thing this civilization left behind to a philosophical testament. Even jade is shattered. Even gold is crushed, even Quetzal plumes are torn. One surviving verse attributed to him runs, in the careful translations scholars have built from Nahuatl sources over the past century. We do not live forever on this earth, only a little while here. It is not a poem about resignation so much as a poem about proportion. An attempt to hold, in the same breath, the unbearable brevity of a human life and the stubborn, continuing beauty of living it anyway, flower and song both, wilting and singing in the same instant. This is the intellectual soil the sacrifices grew from, and it complicates, rather than excuses, everything that has come before in this account. A civilization capable of building the Tzompantli was, simultaneously and without any sense of contradiction that its own thinkers ever recorded, a civilization capable of asking, in formal verse recited before assembled nobility, whether anything a person built or loved could possibly outlast the fact of dying. Nezahualcoyotl's own life supplies an unbearable illustration of exactly this tension. Sources describe him as a ruler who, even as he presided over a court that practiced the same sacrificial rites as Tenochtitlan, attempted at various points in his reign to build a temple to an unseen, singular creator god beyond the crowded pantheon of Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc and all the rest, a god, by some accounts, who required no blood at all, only prayer and the quiet contemplation of a universe too vast for the ordinary gods to fully explain. The experiment, so far as the fragmentary record allows any judgment, did not replace the older rites. It existed alongside them, one more attempt by one more searching mind to find some accounting of the world that did not end. Every single time, at the edge of an obsidian blade, poetry gatherings, called Netatlistli, were held regularly among the Mexican nobility, structured competitions in which poets composed and performed verse on set themes, the fleeting nature of life, the beauty of flowers, the glory and futility of war, the eventual dissolution of even the greatest cities into dust, accompanied by music judged by assembled peers, the finest compositions remembered and repeated long after their composer's own death. which was, in a civilization organized so completely around the terror of impermanence, very nearly the only kind of immortality anyone here believed was actually available. A warrior's flowery death bought him 4 years at the sun's side and an eternity as a hummingbird among flowers. A poet's flower and song bought him something smaller, and in its own way, no less remarkable, a verse that another mouth might still be reciting long after the mouth that first shaped it had gone still. It is worth remembering. When the Tzompantli and the obsidian blade threatened to become the whole of this civilization's portrait, that the same people who built that wall of skulls also built, out of nothing but breath and memory, a body of philosophical poetry sophisticated enough that scholars 500 years later would devote entire careers to recovering and translating it, and that both of these things, the wall and the poem, were understood by the Mexica themselves not as contradictions requiring explanation, but as two faces of the identical, unbearable fact every civilization on Earth has had to find its own way of living beside. That everything ends, that the ending cannot be bargained away, no matter how carefully it is studied, and that the only real choice left to anyone is what to build, and what to sing in the little while allowed before it does. In the years before the ships arrived, the sky over the Valley of Mexico began, by every account later gathered from those who lived through it, to behave strangely. The first sign came roughly a decade before Cortez's fleet reached the coast. A great tongue of fire, bright as a wound torn in the night sky, appeared in the east and burned there steadily for the better part of a year, visible every night, growing brighter as it climbed and dimmer as it fell toward dawn, until it faded and vanished as unexplainably as it had come. Later ages would call it a comet and move on. The Tonalpuque, who watched it night after night from the House of Darkness, had no such easy word for what they were seeing, and no entry in the long-accumulated memory of their calendar's cycles that matched a sign of quite this duration or brightness. They recorded it, and they worried. The second sign came without any comet's warning at all. The temple of Huitzilopochtli, standing at the summit of the Templo Mayor's red-painted face, the very stairway Ome Toctli had climbed, the very shrine where his heart had been lifted to the sky, caught fire from within, its wooden superstructure bursting into flame with no torch, no lightning, no apparent cause that any priest on duty that night could identify. Men ran with water. The fire did not respond to water the way fire was supposed to. It burned hotter, they said afterward, the more water was thrown against it, as though something in the flame itself refused the ordinary law that governed every other fire they had ever fought, until it had consumed the temple's upper structure and simply, finally, exhausted itself. The third came soon after. Lightning struck the thatched roof of the temple of Xiuhtecutli, the old fire god whose flame the priests kindled anew at every binding of the years, and set it ablaze. But the sky that night, witnesses insisted afterward, had been entirely clear. No storm clouds, no rain, no thunder rolling in from the mountains to give the strike its ordinary context. Only a sudden bolt out of a calm and starlit dark, striking the one temple in the whole city dedicated to fire's own patron, and priests who had spent their lives reading meaning into far smaller coincidences than this one did not need much training to feel the weight of it. A fourth sign followed in daylight, which unsettled the city more than any of the nighttime signs had, because daylight offered no shadow for uncertainty to hide in. A great burning light, described afterward as splitting into 3 separate glowing pieces, streaked across the sky while the sun itself still hung visibly overhead, trailing sparks like a fire dragged across stone, and the people who saw it in the open plazas and along the causeways screamed and scattered, certain that whatever this thing was, it belonged to no ordinary daytime sky they had ever known. The fifth sign rose not from the heavens, but from the lake itself. The water of Texcoco, calm and windless by every account, began without warning to boil and churn as though a great heat burned beneath its surface, waves rising higher than any storm had ever produced on those normally placid shallows, surging against the causeways and into the lower streets of the city, flooding homes built to withstand ordinary seasonal rises, but not this. A lake behaving, suddenly and briefly, like something enraged. The sixth sign was a voice, and of everything reported in these unsettled years, it is the one that appears most often in the most independent accounts. suggesting whatever moved through the collective memory of the city in these years had crystallized around this image more than any other. At night, through the empty streets, in a voice unmistakably a woman's, mourning could be heard rising and falling in the dark, a voice later identified with the goddess Cihuacoatl, patroness of childbirth and one of the oldest and most feared figures in the entire Mexica pantheon, crying out words that every account preserves in some close variation of the same devastating sentence. "My children, we must go far away. My children, where shall I take you?" Mothers woke their households to listen. No one who heard it, by every surviving account, needed the priests to tell them it was not an ordinary grief. The seventh sign arrived by more mundane means. Fishermen working the lake's reed beds one morning caught, in their nets, a strange ash-gray bird, roughly the size and shape of a crane, bearing on the crown of its head something that looked, to every witness who examined it, unmistakably like a small mirror or polished disc of obsidian. The bird was brought directly to Moctezuma, who is reported to have looked into the mirror set into its skull and seen there, reflected back at him in the deep black glass, not his own face but a night sky crowded with stars, though the hour outside was full daylight, and then, as he watched, the stars themselves seemed to part and give way to the image of warriors, armed and marching, approaching as if from a great distance. Before the whole vision dissolved and the bird, priests reported afterward, simply vanished from where it had been held. The eighth and final sign, recorded by Sahagun's informants with the particular unease reserved for the strangest of the list, told of deformed and monstrous people, some with two heads fused at a single body, others bearing other unnamed and unrecorded abnormalities, being brought before Moctezuma from various corners of the city and the provinces beyond it, presented to him as omens the way the mirrored bird had been presented, and who then, each of them, in the accounts that describe it, disappeared before the ruler's own eyes, as suddenly and inexplicably as they had arrived. No modern reader can weigh these 8 signs and separate, with any real confidence, the events that genuinely occurred from the meaning later applied to them after the fact by survivors trying to make sense of a catastrophe that had, by the time these accounts were gathered, already happened. Comets are real. Lightning strikes real temples on real clear nights more often than superstition alone would predict. Lake water can surge without wind for reasons entirely explicable by seismic activity the Mexica had no vocabulary to describe as such. What is not in doubt because it survives in account after account gathered independently from elders who lived through these very years is the dread. Something in the air of Tenochtitlan, in the years counting down toward 1519, had already begun to feel, to the people living inside it, unlike any of the ordinary years that had come before. Moctezuma, by every description of him in this period, grew quieter. He fasted more than his advisors thought wise. He sent his finest priests and even envoys to consult with priests among his rivals, seeking any reading of the sky or the calendar that might explain what was coming, and found none of them able to offer him the one thing every previous crisis in his reign had always eventually produced: a ritual, a sacrifice, a fire that could be kindled, a debt whose exact payment was known and could therefore be made. For the first time in the memory of anyone then living in the Valley of Mexico, the House of Darkness had run out of answers. None of it was enough. This is the sentence no priest standing atop the Templo Mayor in 1507, watching the new fire of the last successful binding of the years spread out across a jubilant valley, could have imagined writing. The rite had worked. It had always worked. The sun had returned as it always returned, and the calculus that underwrote this entire civilization, pay the debt, and the world continues, had once again been proven correct by the only evidence that mattered: another dawn. 12 years later, in 1519, a small fleet of ships, neither the priest's astronomy nor the sacred calendar had any category prepared for, appeared off the coast the Mexica called the Eastern Sea, carrying a few hundred Spanish soldiers under a minor nobleman named Hernán Cortés, along with something far more consequential than any weapon those soldiers carried: smallpox, a disease this entire hemisphere had never once encountered, against which no body in it carried any resistance at all, and carrying, too, something the empire's own machinery had spent generations manufacturing without ever quite recognizing what it was building: Tlaxcala, the same proud, unconquered rival against whom Cuautli captured Toctli in a flower war fought for the mutual benefit of both nations' altars, had endured, by 1519, nearly a century of exactly that arrangement, their sons taken, their warriors bled, generation after generation, into an empire that had calculated, with real strategic precision, that a resentful, ritually weakened rival was more useful than a conquered and pacified one. The calculation had worked for 100 years. It did not survive contact with an enemy from entirely outside the system it was built for. When Cortés reached Tlaxcala's borders, its leaders did not see one more raiding empire to be resisted or briefly accommodated. They saw, for the first time in living memory, the possibility of an ally powerful enough to finally end a century of flower wars, of sons marched to Tenochtitlan's altars, of a debt they had never agreed to and could never stop paying. After weeks of initial fighting, tens of thousands of Tlaxcalan warriors joined Cortés's few hundred Spaniards, and it was this combined force, overwhelmingly indigenous, a fact later Spanish accounts would spend considerable effort minimizing, that marched at last on Tenochtitlan itself, Moctezuma. Watching this alliance approach across the causeways he himself had once considered his empire's greatest defense, made a decision later centuries would judge as the empire's fatal error. Though it looked, from inside the House of Darkness's mounting years of dread, like the only reasonable choice a ruler faced with omens he could not decode had left available to him. He chose to receive Cortés as a guest rather than resist him at the water's edge. He sent gifts of gold and featherwork meant, in Mexica diplomatic custom, to establish the visitor's proper rank and to make plain the emperor's own overwhelming wealth and power, gifts the Spanish read instead as proof of a fortune worth seizing outright. He housed the Spanish and their Tlaxcalan allies within the city itself, in one of the great palace complexes at its center, granting them the kind of proximity to his own person that no enemy, in the accumulated memory of Mexica statecraft, had ever before been offered. Within days, Cortés had taken Moctezuma hostage inside his own capital, ruling the city for months through the puppet authority of a great speaker who now gave his orders under armed Spanish guard, while his own nobles watched, with a horror that grew by the week, an emperor who had spent a lifetime navigating omens and calendars and the careful management of an empire's fear, reduced to a captive in the palace his own ancestors had built. The arrangement held unstably for the better part of a year, until Cortés was called away to the coast to deal with a rival Spanish expedition sent to arrest him, and in his absence his deputy Pedro de Alvarado, presiding over a great festival dance held in the temple precinct in honor of Huitzilopochtli during the sacred month of Toxcatl, ordered his soldiers to fall upon the unarmed dancers and nobles gathered there, killing hundreds in the enclosed courtyard in a massacre that finally, after a year of watching their own emperor humiliated, broke whatever restraint had held the city's fury in check. Tenochtitlan rose. Cortés, returning to find his garrison besieged within the palace, brought Moctezuma out onto a rooftop to try to calm the crowd below, and Moctezuma, whatever authority he had once carried over his own people, was answered instead with stones and arrows thrown by subjects who no longer recognized in the humiliated figure before them the great speaker who had once been thought to carry the sun itself across half the sky in his charge. He died within days, whether from the wounds of that crowd or, as some later accounts suggest, by Spanish hands once his usefulness as a hostage had expired. The sources disagree, and no version of the story restores to him the ending that might have matched the weight of everything he had spent his reign trying to hold together. The Spanish and their allies fled the city that same night, in a desperate retreat across the causeways later remembered as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, losing, by their own accounts, well over half their number to Mexica warriors who fell upon the fleeing column in the dark, dragging captured soldiers off toward altars that had by this point every reason in the Mexica understanding of the world to demand exactly this payment from the invaders who had desecrated their most sacred festival. It should have ended there. It did not. Cortés regrouped in Tlaxcalan territory, rebuilt his alliance, and returned within a year with a strategy no Mexica ruler had ever needed to prepare for, not a raid to be repelled at the water's edge. but a siege of the entire island, its causeways cut, its fresh water supply severed, its population already devastated by a smallpox epidemic that had swept through the valley in the intervening months, killing, among a great many others, Moctezuma's own successor before he had ruled even a season, the city that had stood, impossible and magnificent, on its lake for 2 centuries fell in 1521. After a siege of 80 days that matched in its brutality on every side anything the Templo Mayor's stairways had ever witnessed. Starvation, smallpox tearing through a population with no immunity to it, streets that Spanish soldiers themselves described, with something approaching horror as impassable for the corpses filling them. Cuauhtémoc, the last independent ruler of the Mexica, fought on long after the city's fall was already certain, was captured attempting to flee across the lake by canoe, tortured for the location of gold that mostly did not exist, and eventually executed years later on an expedition far from the city he had tried to save. The Templo Mayor itself, the twin pyramids painted red and blue, the summit where Toctli's heart was lifted toward a sun that had, by every measure the Mexica themselves could offer, kept its side of the arrangement faithfully for 200 years, was torn down within a generation, its stones quarried for the foundations of a cathedral built in the same plaza, dedicated to a god who required no captives, no obsidian blade, no new fire kindled in an open chest once every 52 years. For nearly 5 centuries, the Templo Mayor would exist only in the memory carried in Nahuatl songs the friars half recorded and half suppressed, until 1978 when electrical workers in Mexico City, digging beneath a colonial-era street, struck a massive carved stone disc depicting the dismembered goddess Coyolxauhqui, and archaeologists realized, digging further, that the greatest structure of the Mexica world had never actually left. It had only been buried beneath the city built to replace it, one civilization's foundation laid quite literally on top of another's. 4 centuries of asphalt and cathedral stone away from a temple that had once been, to the people who built it, the single most important place on the face of the created world. The 5th sun did not fail because the Mexica stopped paying its debt. It failed because an entirely different kind of debt, the one owed by every isolated population on Earth to the diseases and empires it had never before encountered, came due first, in a currency no priest, however devout, however skilled with the obsidian blade, had ever been trained to pay. How, after everything, the burned temple, the drained lake, the 4 centuries of silence, is any of this still known at all? The honest answer is that most of it very nearly was not. In the years following the conquest, Bishop Juan de Zumárraga and the friars who came with him, convinced with total sincerity that they were saving souls from an eternity in a hell far worse than any Mictlan the old priests had ever described, ordered the great libraries of Mexica, painted books gathered and burned as instruments of idolatry, screen-fold codices of bark paper and deerskin, painted in the vivid pictographic script that had recorded generations of tribute rolls, calendars, songs, and histories, fed by the thousands into fires that did to the Mexica archive in a single generation what centuries of ordinary decay could never have managed. Fewer than 20 pre-conquest codices from the entire Mexica cultural sphere are known to survive anywhere in the world today, scattered across museum vaults in Europe and Mexico, each one treated now with the kind of reverence once reserved for the Templo Mayor's own sacred vessels. That the story survives at all, that Toctli's 11 days of honored captivity, the midwife's speech over a newborn daughter, the 8 omens, the exact wording of Nezahualcoyotl's grief, can be told with any confidence today is owed, strangely and not entirely comfortably, to one of the very friars sent to help erase this world in the first place. Bernardino de Sahagún arrived in New Spain only a handful of years after the conquest, and unlike Zumárraga, became convinced across a working life that would stretch on for decades that a faith imposed on a people whose old world was never truly understood could not hope to take lasting root. He gathered elderly Mexica priests, nobles, and scholars, men who had lived through the empire's final years as adults, who remembered the Templo Mayor standing rather than buried, and set them to work with his own trained Nahua students, questioning them exhaustively in their own language, cross-checking their accounts against one another, recording not just what they said, but, in many cases, the original Nahuatl alongside a Spanish translation, in a vast bilingual encyclopedia that would eventually run to 12 books and come to be known as the Florentine Codex. It is an uneasy inheritance, and honesty requires saying so plainly rather than passing over it. Almost everything reconstructed here: the ritual speeches, the details of the sacrificial rite, the omens, the poetry, reaches the present day only because it first passed through the hands and the theology of the very civilization that had, at the same historical moment, ordered the wholesale destruction of every other written record the Mexica had ever produced. Sahagun's informants were old men reconstructing, from memory and grief, a world already gone, speaking to a friar whose ultimate purpose remained the conversion of their grandchildren. What survives is neither a pure, unmediated Mexica voice nor a simple colonial fabrication, but something harder to categorize and, in its own way, more moving: the last, painstaking act of a defeated civilization's own priests and elders, determined that at least the memory of what they had built and believed would not disappear as completely as the temple itself had. Archaeology has, in the past half-century, begun to supply a second, independent form of testimony the friars could never have offered, one written not in memory and translation, but directly in bone and stone. The 1978 discovery of the Coyolxauhqui stone beneath a Mexico City street opened the way for a systematic excavation of the Templo Mayor's buried foundations that continues, in careful stages, to the present day, turning up thousands of individual offerings: jade, shell, sacrificial knives, and, difficult as it remains to encounter directly, the skeletal remains of the sacrifice themselves, subjected now to isotope analysis, dental examination, and osteological study capable of confirming or complicating, artifact by artifact, what the old chronicles claimed. The evidence that has emerged does not flatter either of the two simple stories later centuries have told about this civilization. It confirms sacrifice at a real and sustained scale, embedded in the ordinary rhythm of the calendar, exactly as the Nahua elders told Sahagun it had been. It also confirms a civilization of genuine sophistication, artistic achievement, and intellectual seriousness that the same colonial narrative eager to justify conquest had every incentive to erase or diminish. The truth, as it usually does, turned out to require more patience and more discomfort than either the old myth of noble savagery or the old myth of mindless butchery had ever been willing to hold. It would be easy, from the comfortable distance of centuries, to let this story end as a simple lesson: a civilization built on horror, and horror, in the end, was what consumed it. It would also be a lie, or at least a much smaller truth than the one the evidence actually supports. The Mexica were not a people who valued life less than any other civilization history has produced. Their poetry, thousands of lines of it, preserved in fragments, mourns the shortness of human life with a tenderness that rivals anything written in Europe or Asia in the same centuries. Is it true that one really lives on Earth? Asks one surviving verse attributed to the poet king Nezahualcoyotl. Not forever on Earth, only a little while here. They built schools for every child, commoner and noble alike, in an age when most of the world offered no such thing. They tracked the movements of Venus with an astronomical precision their European conquerors would not match for 100 years. They fed a city of 200,000 people from gardens they built by hand out of mud and reed on a lake that no one before them had thought could hold a civilization at all. They gave their women half the sky to carry, and gave their daughters formal words of dignity spoken over them before they had drawn their first breath. And they also believed, with a conviction so total it shaped every institution they built, that none of it, the poetry, the astronomy, the floating gardens, the sun rising each morning over the mountains, was free. That belief demanded a payment history has rightly refused to look away from, and this story has not looked away from it either. Ometoctli was real in the sense that thousands like him were real, fed and honored and mourned by men who loved them in whatever way this world had taught them love could survive alongside duty, and then killed by the same hands on the same schedule. for the same unshaken reason, because the alternative, in every particle of what they understood about the universe, was not peace. It was the end of everything. Every civilization the Earth has produced has built some machinery for pretending its costs are smaller than they are. The Mexica built theirs in full view, painted red on temple stone, displayed in a wall of skulls at the city's own front gate, sung about in verse, taught to children as young as 7. There is a kind of honesty in that visibility that many later, gentler-seeming empires, the ones that hid their costs in mines and plantations and factories a comfortable distance from anyone who had to watch, never once managed to match, and the civilization did not, in the end, simply vanish beneath the cathedral built from its own temple's stones. The eagle perched on the cactus, devouring a serpent, the very sign the wandering, unwanted Mexica had read as a command from Huitzilopochtli 2 centuries before Ometeotli's birth. Survives today at the center of the Mexican flag, carried into a national identity that emerged generations after the conquest. From the deliberate work of reclaiming a heritage the conquerors had once tried to erase entirely. The names of Mexica rulers are given to streets and stations across a country that no longer worships their gods but has not forgotten what they built. Millions of Mexicans and their descendants across the world still speak sentences shaped by Nahuatl loanwords: tomato, chocolate, coyote, avocado, small, everyday fossils of a language that outlived the empire that once made it the tongue of power across an entire valley. Each November, in a tradition scholars still debate the exact proportions of, old Mexica beliefs about ancestors returning briefly to visit the living blend, in the observance now known as the Day of the Dead. With the Catholic calendar, the friars imposed marigolds, the same bright flowers once harvested for the Templo Mayor's altars, still piled today on graves and household shrines across the country, in a color and a gesture that would not have looked entirely unfamiliar to Citlalmina, gathering blooms from her own chenampa on an ordinary morning 5 centuries ago. None of this undoes what happened on the summit of that pyramid, and it should not be asked to. But it means the fifth son's story did not end cleanly in 1521, any more than any civilization story ever ends cleanly at the moment its capital falls. It fractured and scattered and went underground, and resurfaced in forms its own priests would not have recognized, and is, in fragments large and small, still being lived by people who have never set foot near the buried foundation of the Templo Mayor and would not necessarily think to connect their Tuesday dinner or their grandmother's altar to a debt once paid in obsidian and blood. This, too, is a kind of afterlife. Not the 4 years at the sun's side the priests promised their bravest dead, but something stranger and more durable, a civilization's habits of language, food, and memory quietly outlasting the empire, the gods, and the very sun they were built to keep alive. The fifth sun is still, by the old calendar, unfinished. Its ending was never witnessed the way its priests expected it to be, not swallowed by star demons at a failed binding of the years, but interrupted, mid-debt, by ships from a world that did not know it was owed anything at all, somewhere beneath the streets of a city of over 20 million people, now standing where Tenochtitlan once rose from its lake. The foundation of the Templo Mayor still holds its place in the dark. The stairway Ometeotli climbed still buried in careful, undisturbed layers beneath the modern stone. The lake is gone, drained centuries ago by the empire that replaced the one that built the causeways across it. The chinampas are gone mostly, though a few still float, improbably, in a quiet corner of the city's south, tended by farmers who may not know exactly what their small plots of reed and mud once helped sustain. And the sun still rises, every morning, over the same eastern mountains, exactly as it did the morning Ometeotli's heart was lifted toward it, exactly as it did every morning for 2 centuries before that, owing nothing to anyone now, paid in full or not, moving across the sky the way it always has, indifferent, patient, and utterly unaware that an entire civilization once built its whole understanding of existence around the quiet, terrible certainty that it was. Perhaps that is the last honest thing left to say about the fifth sun, and about every sun any civilization has ever convinced itself it was responsible for keeping aloft. The debt was never really owed to the sky. It was owed to the fear of what an empty sky might mean. And that fear, at least, needs no obsidian blade to keep it alive. It only needs a species patient enough and frightened enough and capable of enough love for the world it has built to keep looking up,